5 true scary stories from a haunted school. You will be scared when you hear these stories. The old school stood in the middle of a small, quiet suburban town, its towering structure casting long, twisted shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. Weathered by decades of storms and neglect, the once grand building now seemed like a forgotten relic of the past, slowly crumbling into the earth it had been built upon. Ivy crawled up its brick walls, and broken windows gaped like the hollow eyes of a long-dead creature. The school, despite its fading grandeur, had always been a place of mystery, its reputation whispering through the halls and the surrounding town like a secret passed from one generation to the next. The town itself had grown accustomed to the rumors, stories of strange occurrences, missing students, unexplained noises, and the occasional sighting of something that simply shouldn't be there. Every year, another class would graduate, and the rumors would fade into the background, forgotten by most, but never entirely gone. The faculty, too, had grown adept at dismissing the odd events. Those who worked there spoke of strange sensations, chill winds in empty hallways, whispers in the dead of night, but they brushed it off as mere superstition. After all, it was just an old building with a long history. What could possibly be haunting it? But there was something different about this year. The usual stories and whispers had become more persistent, more insistent. It was as though the school had awoken from its long slumber, stretching out its dark fingers, reaching for anyone who dared to uncover the truth. The building felt alive in ways that weren't entirely natural. The creaking of the floorboards echoed like the groan of a waking giant, and sometimes, late at night, students swore they could hear faint whispers drifting from the walls. But most dismissed it, too caught up in their own lives to care. That was until a group of curious students, tired of hearing the same tired ghost stories, decided to seek the truth for themselves. They had grown bored with the tales of past hauntings that seemed to hold no substance. They'd heard it all before. The legends of the disappearing footsteps, the strange noises in the library, the cursed history teacher, and the room that seemed to trap students in time. It was all old news. The group, a mix of skeptics and believers, made a pact one cold autumn afternoon. They would investigate the source of these stories themselves and expose the truth. Armed with nothing but their curiosity and a burning desire to uncover what lay beneath the school's decaying surface, they set out to explore every corner, every abandoned room, every forgotten hall. The more they searched, the more they felt the school watching them, waiting. Their investigation led them to the library, an ancient, musty room filled with rows upon rows of forgotten books and papers. As they wandered through the aisles, their hands brushing over dust-covered shelves, they stumbled upon a hidden diary, buried deep within a disorganized stack of old history books. It was old, its leather cover cracked, the pages yellowed with age. But what caught their attention wasn't its age or condition. It was the feeling that came with it, the sense of something ancient, something powerful. The diary, when they opened it, revealed dark secrets written in hurried, almost frantic handwriting. The pages were filled with accounts of strange happenings from the past, stories from former students and teachers, some of whom had mysteriously vanished, others who had become unrecognizably different after encountering something within the school. Each entry spoke of a deepening terror that had taken root in the very foundation of the building. The school was cursed, it seemed, haunted by forces far beyond anyone's understanding. But as they read further, the students realized the diary itself was more than just a collection of stories. It was as though the book had its own power, as if it were drawing them into the very narrative it held. The words seemed to shift and change as they read, a subtle but undeniable force pulling them deeper into the mystery. With every page turned, they felt more connected to the haunted history of the school, as if they were becoming part of it, trapped in the same web that had ensnared generations before them. The truth was now clear to them. The stories, the rumors, the whispers, they were all part of something much darker. Something was watching them, guiding them through the darkened halls of the school, and the closer they came to the truth, the more dangerous it became. They had awakened something ancient and powerful, and now there was no turning back. The school, it seemed, had decided that it was time to reveal its secrets, and those secrets would come at a cost. Story 1. The dark history of the school. The school, with its towering spires and ivy-clad facade, had always been a place that evoked a sense of dread, even among those who'd spent their entire lives there. The crumbling bricks, the long corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, and the eerie creaks of the old wooden floors all combined to create a sense that the building itself was alive, and not in a good way. It had stood for over a century, and though its students and faculty had changed over the years, there was something about it that remained constant, something that whispered of a time long forgotten, of a past that no one dared to speak of. The school had been built in the early 1900s, an ambitious project for a town that was still growing. It was meant to be a symbol of progress, a modern institution that would serve the community for generations. But what no one knew, what no one could have known, was that the land upon which the school was built had been desecrated long before the first brick was laid. Beneath the surface, buried deep in the earth, were the remains of an old burial ground, a place where the town's earliest settlers had buried their dead. And when the builders began to excavate, they disturbed something that should have been left undisturbed. The earliest incidents began shortly after the construction of the school was completed. At first, they were small, unexplained noises echoing through the halls late at night, the sensation of being watched in the darkened classrooms, flickering lights that no one could explain. But soon the tragedies began. The first death was a student, a young girl who had vanished without a trace. She had been seen walking down the hall after school, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors, but when a teacher went to check, she was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere. A search was launched, but it turned up nothing. Her disappearance was eventually chalked up to her running away, but the whispers among the students were different. They spoke of something darker, something that had claimed her, something that had been waiting for her. As the years passed, the strange occurrences only grew more frequent. Other students disappeared, always without a trace, and in the aftermath, strange things would happen. Some of those who returned from their disappearances were not the same. Their eyes were empty, as if the very soul had been drained from them. They were silent, withdrawn, their minds shattered by something that had happened to them in the time they were missing. No one knew what happened to them, and the administration did everything they could to keep the stories from getting out. After all, a school with a reputation for tragedy and violence was bad for business. The parents didn't need to know the truth, so the administration covered up the incidents, twisting the facts, planting false information, and forcing the families of the victims to keep quiet. But no matter how hard they tried to silence the rumors, the truth began to slip through the cracks. The whispers about the school's cursed foundation were passed down from one generation of students to the next. Those who had been around long enough to know better would tell stories. Stories about the early days of the school, about the things that happened back when it was first built. And in those stories, the school was not just a building, but a place with a life of its own, a place that hungered for the souls of those who dared to walk its halls. The stories were always the same. Students would disappear, only to return weeks later, changed, empty. Some spoke of a strange coldness that would settle over the school at night, coldness that would seep into the bones of those who stayed too long. Others claimed to have seen strange shadows moving in the corners of their vision, fleeting glimpses of figures that disappeared as soon as they turned to look. But no one dared to question the stories too loudly. No one wanted to be the next one to disappear. One of the darkest chapters of the school's history came in the early 1920s. A group of students, a tight-knit circle of friends, had been investigating the strange happenings themselves. They had heard the rumors, they had heard the stories, and they wanted to find out if they were true. Armed with nothing but their curiosity and a deep sense of youthful bravado, they ventured into the school's basement late one night. What they found there would haunt them forever. The basement was a maze of old storage rooms, forgotten archives, and long-abandoned equipment. But in the farthest corner, behind a series of rusted lockers, they found a hidden door, a door that had been bricked up for years. The door was heavy, covered in layers of dust and grime, but it opened with an eerie creak. Behind it, they discovered a small, dark room, a room that had been sealed off for decades. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that none of them recognized. And in the center of the room was an altar built from the very stones of the school's foundation, stone that had been taken from the old burial ground. It was clear that this was no ordinary room, but a place of dark rituals, a place where something terrible had once been performed. The students quickly fled the room, but one of them, Daphne, was never seen again. The others were found wandering the halls, disoriented and terrified, their minds shattered by what they had seen. They were locked away in asylums, their lives ruined by the horrors they had uncovered. The administration quickly swept the incident under the rug, but the whispers continued. The students who had gone looking for answers had found them, and in doing so, had opened a door that should never have been opened. As time passed, the dark history of the school was buried deeper and deeper, hidden beneath layers of denial and silence. But the land on which it stood, an ancient burial ground, refused to be forgotten. The past, it seemed, had not been content to remain buried. It had been disturbed, and now it was awake. And with every generation, the ghosts of the school's past crept a little closer, their whispers growing louder, their grip on the living growing tighter. The administration, of course, continued to deny it all. They claimed the school was just a place like any other. But as the years passed, and more students vanished, the truth became undeniable. The school was cursed, a place built upon a foundation of human tragedy and desecration. And as long as it stood, the past would never be forgotten. The spirits that had been disturbed, the lives that had been lost, would continue to haunt the school forever. In the end, the school was more than just a place. It was a monument to the forgotten, a testament to the darkness that could never be fully erased. And no matter how many new generations passed through its doors, no matter how many students graduated and moved on, the school would always be a place where the past lingered, watching, waiting, ready to claim those who dared to uncover its secrets. Story 2. The Spirit of Detention Room. The detention room had always been a place of dread for students, though few could ever explain why. Nestled in the far corner of the school, it was a small, cramped space, poorly lit, with cracked windows that allowed only the faintest glimmer of daylight to seep through. The wooden desks, weathered and chipped from years of use, lined the room in neat rows, their surfaces worn smooth by the constant grind of pens and the weight of time. The air in the room was thick, heavy, as though it were filled with the ghosts of all the hours spent in silence, the weight of those long moments pressing down on anyone unlucky enough to be sent there. It was a place that no one wanted to be, yet every student knew that sooner or later they would find themselves sitting in that room, staring at the walls as the minutes ticked by. Some came for minor infractions, others for more serious offenses. But no matter the reason, the detention room was always a reminder of the school's authority, its power to punish, to control. And for the longest time, no one had known the true reason why the room was so unsettling. But the students who were sent there soon learned. There was something far darker than mere punishment lurking in that room. It had all started with Derek. Derek was a rebellious student, a troublemaker in every sense of the word. He was the kind of kid who never followed the rules, who always found a way to make life difficult for his teachers. He would skip classes, pull pranks, and talk back to anyone who dared to discipline him. His reputation as a troublemaker was legendary, and for all his defiance, Derek didn't seem to care about the consequences. Detention was a frequent stop for him, and it seemed that every time he was sent there, he found a new way to push the boundaries of what was acceptable. It was on one fateful day, many years ago, that Derek's defiance caught up with him. He had been sent to detention once again, this time for an especially heinous act of mischief. The room was empty save for him. The dull buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead, the only sound in the otherwise quiet space. The teacher on duty that day had never been one to engage much with students, preferring to leave them to their own devices. And so Derek was left alone, seated at one of the old desks, his legs stretched out before him as he slouched in his seat. But as the minutes wore on, Derek began to feel a strange unease creeping up his spine. At first, it was just a silence, deep, oppressive silence that seemed to have a weight of its own. Then, a chill ran through the room, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He looked around, but there was no one else there. The room seemed empty, yet somehow it wasn't. Derek's breath began to quicken as the temperature dropped further, and a cold wind swept across the room, ruffling his hair. It was as though the room itself was breathing, exhaling a cold, ghostly air that seemed to encircle him. He stood up, looking around the room in confusion. The windows were tightly shut, the door was locked, and yet the chill persisted. Suddenly, there came a noise, a soft scraping sound coming from the far corner of the room. Derek's eyes darted to the corner, but there was nothing there. The scraping stopped, only to be replaced by a soft whisper, one that he could barely make out. It sounded like a name, Derek's name. His heart began to race. He had heard rumors about the detention room, of course. There were whispers that the room was cursed, that it was haunted by the spirit of a former student. But Derek was the type of person who didn't believe in such nonsense. He had always brushed it off as the overactive imaginations of kids looking for a thrill. But as the whispers grew louder, as the cold winds intensified, Derek couldn't deny that something was wrong. And then it happened. With a sudden, violent burst of force, one of the desks in the back of the room was flung across the floor. Derek jumped back, his eyes wide in terror. The desk slammed into the wall, leaving a deep dent in the wood. He could hear the faint echo of footsteps, the unmistakable sound of boots scraping across the floor. But when he looked, there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, almost as though they were circling him, each word dripping with malice. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it all stopped. Derek was left in the dead silence of the room, his body frozen in fear. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He was trapped, locked in this room, alone with whatever haunted it. The air was thick with tension, with something unseen that pressed down on him, suffocating him. He reached for the door, but the handle was icy cold, his fingers unable to grip it. And then he heard it, the final whisper, "Get out." That was the last thing Derek ever heard. No one knows exactly what happened that day, but when the teacher returned, Derek was gone. The room was locked, and there was no sign of a struggle. It was as though he had simply disappeared, vanished into thin air. The authorities never found him, and the school administration quickly swept the incident under the rug. The official report claimed that Derek had run away, that he had simply walked out of the room and never returned. But the students knew the truth. They could feel it in their bones, in the very air that filled the detention room. Ever since that day, the room had become a place of terror. The students who were unlucky enough to be sent there reported strange occurrences. The temperature would drop sharply, the lights would flicker, and a heavy, oppressive silence would fill the room. And then there was the feeling of being watched, always watched by something that was not human. The whispers would return, a faint echo in the back of their minds, urging them to leave, to escape before it was too late. No one could explain it, but everyone knew that the spirit of Derek lingered in that room. His rage, his frustration, had become part of the room itself. He was no longer just a ghost. He was a manifestation of the school's dark energy, feeding off the fears and weaknesses of those who were unlucky enough to be trapped there. And as the years went on, Derek's presence grew stronger, more active. Students who misbehaved were the ones who felt his wrath the most. Those who came to the detention room with their minds filled with rebellion, who dared to challenge the rules, found themselves trapped in a nightmare. For some, the punishments were subtle, chilly drafts, flickering lights, the sensation of something brushing against their skin in the dark. But for others, the consequences were far worse. Some left the room shaken, their minds broken, never the same as they had been before. And for a few unlucky souls, the room took more than just their sanity. It took their very lives. The school tried to cover up the growing number of strange incidents, but the rumors spread, and the students whispered about the cursed detention room. It had become a prison within the prison, a place where the rebellion of the living met the vengeance of the dead. And as long as the school stood, Derek's spirit would continue to haunt that room, a constant reminder of the price of disobedience, both in life and after death. Story 3. The Library of Lost Souls. The school's library was a place that many students avoided, not because of its imposing size or the sheer volume of books it housed, but because of the unsettling aura that seemed to cling to the ancient walls. The shelves, stretching from floor to ceiling, were packed with old, dusty tomes, many of which had not been touched in decades, perhaps even longer. It was the kind of library that felt as though it had secrets, dark, buried secrets, that it was desperate to keep hidden. The air in the library always felt thick with history, as though the very weight of time had settled in the corners, thick and stifling. The room was vast, its labyrinthine corridors of shelves twisting and turning in impossible ways. No matter how many times a student walked through it, they could never be sure they knew the full layout. The aisles seemed to change, to stretch in directions that didn't make sense, and the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead often gave way to sudden silences, the kind of quiet that felt like a presence was watching. Whispers, faint and barely audible, sometimes echoed in the air. Voices from the past carried on the stale wind. It was this very sense of unease that made the library such a dangerous place. For it wasn't just the atmosphere that was threatening, it was the books themselves. The collection was said to contain volumes that were not available to the public, books that were banned, suppressed, or forgotten by the world outside. Ancient texts that whispered of forbidden knowledge, secret histories, and truths that the world was never meant to know. The library was not merely a place to read. It was a place that devoured, consumed. Those who spent too much time there found themselves drawn into its depths, lured by the promise of secrets that could change everything. It was always the same. Students who came to study or satisfy their curiosity would disappear, never to be seen again. Some of them were found later, wandering the aisles in a daze, their minds shattered, as though they had seen something they were never meant to witness. Others vanished entirely, leaving no trace behind except for the eerie silence that followed in their wake. Sophie Thompson was one of those students who had always been drawn to the library. As a child, she had heard the rumors of the haunted books, the vanishing students, the strange, unexplainable happenings that surrounded the old building. But Sophie was never one to believe in ghost stories. She was a seeker, always looking for the deeper truths, the things that others were too afraid to touch. And so, despite the warnings, she found herself at the library one rainy afternoon, determined to uncover the mystery of the place. She had heard stories of the books that were hidden in the back, books that had been placed there by the school's previous librarian, a woman who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. Rumors suggested that these books were dangerous, that reading them could lead to madness, even death. But Sophie didn't believe in such things. She thought it was all nonsense, just superstition meant to keep people from looking too deeply. When she first stepped into the library, she was struck by the overwhelming sense of age, the smell of musty paper, and the weight of centuries pressing down on her. The shelves stretched up into the shadows, far beyond what the eye could see, and the air felt thick with an unseen presence. Sophie ignored the chill crawling up her spine and made her way deeper into the library, determined to find what she was looking for. The deeper she went, the more disorienting the layout became. The aisles twisted in unnatural angles, the shelves crowded together in ways that didn't make sense. No matter how much she walked, it felt as though she hadn't moved forward at all. The aisles seemed to change behind her, the bookshelves shifting, their contents rearranging themselves in subtle ways. There were no windows in the library, and the dim overhead lights flickered at irregular intervals, casting strange shadows that seemed to writhe and shift like living things. Sophie pressed on, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. She was determined to find the hidden section of the library, the place where the forbidden books were said to be stored. After what felt like hours of wandering, she finally came upon a secluded corner, hidden behind a stack of dusty old volumes. A door, barely noticeable, stood there, its surface covered in age-old cobwebs. She pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the room was smaller than the rest of the library, but it was densely packed with books, more books than Sophie could have imagined. Their covers were worn and faded, some so old that the text was barely legible. The shelves were crammed with volumes that looked ancient, some bound in strange materials that Sophie couldn't quite identify. A sense of foreboding filled the room, and she felt her heart quicken. There was something profoundly wrong about this place, something that tugged at the edges of her mind, as though the very air in the room was alive with malevolent energy. She reached for one of the books, an old leather-bound volume with no title on its cover. As her fingers brushed the spine, she felt a cold shiver run down her back. The moment she touched the book, a voice echoed in her mind, a whisper, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It was a warning, a plea for her to stop. "Leave this place," the voice said. "You don't know what you're doing." Sophie's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't let go of the book. She couldn't. It was as though it had a pull on her, a force that she couldn't explain. With trembling hands, she opened the cover and began to read. The words on the pages seemed to shift and change before her eyes, rearranging themselves into phrases that didn't make sense. The deeper she read, the more the library around her seemed to close in, the shelves warping and distorting. Her mind began to swim, the words blurring into shapes and figures, and she felt as though she were no longer in the library at all. She was somewhere else, somewhere dark and oppressive, surrounded by whispers, by voices, by the souls of those who had come before her. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, overwhelming, as though hundreds of voices were speaking at once, each one desperate, pleading, warning her to stop. But it was too late. Sophie's vision blurred, and she felt herself being pulled into the very fabric of the library, drawn into the depths of its dark, tangled corridors. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She was trapped. When Sophie's friends arrived at the library later that day, they found her sitting at one of the tables, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the pages of the forbidden book. Her body was there, but her mind, her soul, was gone. She couldn't remember how she had come to be there, what had happened to her, or why she couldn't move. She was lost in the labyrinth of the library, caught in the web of knowledge that had claimed so many before her. From that day on, Sophie's friends knew better than to venture into the library. But the stories continued, whispered among the students. The library had claimed another soul, another victim of its endless maze of books. And every so often, students would swear they heard faint whispers coming from the aisles, voices that seemed to beckon them, urging them to join the lost souls who wandered the shelves, forever trapped in the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. Story 4. The Disappearing Footsteps. The halls of the school were silent, save for the soft shuffle of shoes against the linoleum floors and the occasional distant murmur of students in classrooms. It was late in the afternoon, and most of the school's inhabitants had already gone home for the day. The only sound now was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the occasional flicker of a dying bulb. But then came the footsteps. At first, they were subtle, almost imperceptible, soft echoes that seemed to linger in the air long after the footfalls had faded. Emily Dawson, a senior who stayed late to finish some work in the library, was the first to notice them. She'd been walking down the corridor toward the exit when she heard the distinct sound of footsteps behind her. She paused, glancing over her shoulder, but the hallway was empty, just as it had been moments before. She shrugged it off as nothing more than a trick of the mind, a product of the long hours spent staring at textbooks and notes. But as Emily continued walking, the footsteps followed, perfectly matching her pace. Her heart raced as she picked up speed, glancing back again. Still no one was there. The hall was empty. This unsettling pattern continued over the next few days. Other students began to hear the footsteps as well. At first, they too dismissed it as a mere coincidence. But the sounds were becoming more frequent and more noticeable. It wasn't just one set of footsteps, it was multiple sets, echoing off the walls, some distant, others unnervingly close. No matter how many times they checked behind them, no one was ever there. Anna Fisher, a shy sophomore who usually kept to herself, was one of the next to experience it. She was walking down the hallway, her bag slung over her shoulder, when the footsteps started. They began behind her, growing louder as they kept pace with her own. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she whirled around. But again, no one was there. The hallway was just as empty as it had been before, but the footsteps, they kept coming. They were getting closer. Anna's pulse quickened, and she started to run, the sound of those invisible footsteps echoing in her ears, urging her to go faster. She bolted through the hallway, her shoes tapping against the floor in rapid succession, her breath ragged with fear. As she neared the door, she dared one last glance behind her. The footsteps stopped. For a brief moment, the hall was silent, save for the frantic beating of her own heart. She hurried out the door, her hands shaking, her body covered in a cold sweat. But the feeling of being followed didn't leave her. It lingered like a shadow that couldn't be shaken, creeping along the edges of her thoughts. The strange occurrences continued to spread like wildfire. It wasn't just the upperclassmen or the freshmen. It was everyone. The footsteps followed each student, no matter where they went, no matter how far down the hallway they walked. They were everywhere. In the bathrooms, the stairwells, the old gymnasium. No one was spared. Some of the students tried to laugh it off, calling it a ghost story for the modern age. But the laughter never quite reached their eyes, and the tension in the school was palpable. The atmosphere had shifted. No one felt safe anymore. It was as if the school itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to slip up, to make a mistake, and it was drawing closer with every passing day. Some students began to feel the footsteps even when they were alone in their own classrooms, sitting at their desks, staring out the window, lost in thought. The sound of them was faint at first, a faint tapping in the background, like the echo of shoes on distant pavement. Then it would grow louder, closer, until it was impossible to ignore. Jake Miller, a junior, had always been skeptical of ghost stories. He'd heard his share of spooky rumors in the hallways, but nothing ever made him afraid until he started hearing the footsteps. One afternoon, he stayed after school to finish a project in one of the science labs. The quiet was deafening, the air still and thick with the scent of chemicals and old paper. Jake sat hunched over a notebook, scribbling down his ideas for a science fair project when he first heard it. A faint tapping. Jake froze, his pen still poised over the page. His gaze darted around the lab, but there was no one in sight. His stomach tightened in irritation. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. He was alone. It was probably just the pipes or something. But as he leaned back in his chair, the sound came again. Closer this time, more distinct, like someone walking just behind him. Jake's eyes widened, his body going rigid. He spun around, but again, the room was empty. He felt his pulse quicken as the air grew thicker, suffocating. It was as if the footsteps were following him, waiting for him to do something, anything that would make him react. He tried to stand up, but his legs felt heavy, like they were trapped in place. Every step he took toward the door was met by the creeping sound, inching closer, as though whatever was behind him was right there, close enough to reach out and touch him. Jake's hand shot out to grip the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. Panic surged through him as he struggled, desperate to escape. Finally, the door swung open, and he bolted into the hallway. The footsteps followed. When Jake told his friends about it the next day, they looked at him like he was crazy. "It's just your imagination," they said. "It's the stress. Finals are coming up. We're all hearing things." But Jake knew what he had heard. He knew what had followed him. The footsteps hadn't been a figment of his imagination. Something was in the school with them, something that was moving just beyond the edge of their sight. And they weren't alone. More and more students began to experience the same phenomenon. The footsteps would follow them, never showing their source, always lingering just behind them, teasing them with their proximity. The air would grow heavy, their steps would slow, and the sound of the unseen presence would grow louder, as though it was closing in on them. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps would stop, and the silence would hang in the air, thick and suffocating. Some students claimed they could hear the faint breathing of someone just behind them, the press of a body that wasn't there. Others said they could feel the touch of invisible hands brushing against their shoulders, sending cold shivers down their spines. They couldn't escape it, couldn't outrun it. It wasn't long before the entire school became consumed with fear. No one felt safe walking the halls anymore. Teachers avoided certain parts of the school, the old, dimly lit hallways where the footsteps seemed to echo the loudest. The sounds were no longer just a matter of paranoia. They were real, and as the days passed, the whispers began to grow. The students started to ask questions, searching for answers to the terrifying mystery. Some said the footsteps were the ghosts of former students, lingering souls who had never left the school. Others believed the school itself had become a kind of prison, holding something trapped within its walls, something that had been there for a long time, something that was now awake. But the truth, as it always seemed to be, was far darker than they could ever have imagined. The footsteps didn't come from anywhere. They came from everywhere. The school was following them. Story 5. The Cursed History Teacher. The classroom was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the air feel thick and oppressive. Mr. Crawford stood at the front of the room, his wiry frame hunched over as he scribbled furiously on the blackboard, his movements quick and jerky. The chalk squeaked against the surface, the sound more unsettling than it had any right to be. His students watched, nervous glances flicking between each other, as the history teacher muttered under his breath. His voice was low, almost inaudible, but his words seemed to crawl under their skin, like they were being etched into their minds. History is not just a collection of events, Mr. Crawford's voice rasped. It is the key to everything, to power, to immortality, to the unknown. At the back of the room, Ella Thompson shifted uneasily in her seat, tugging at the hem of her sleeve. She had heard the rumors about Mr. Crawford, the whispers in the hallways that he had once been part of some ancient, forbidden ritual. They said he had sought knowledge beyond human understanding, that he had paid the price for his ambition, and now the curse was slowly consuming him, both mind and body. Some even claimed that he had stopped aging, his face becoming more gaunt and hollow with every passing year. Ella had always dismissed the rumors as just that, rumors. But there was something undeniably unsettling about Mr. Crawford. Something in the way he spoke, in the intensity of his gaze. It was like he could see into her very soul, like he knew all of her darkest thoughts and fears without a word. She tried to focus on the lesson, but the words on the blackboard seemed to blur together, as though the lessons were being warped, twisted. It was always the same. The history of the world, the great civilizations, the wars, the rulers. But through Mr. Crawford's eyes, it was more than just dates and events. It was something else entirely. It was as though he was seeing something they weren't, something dark and hidden beneath the surface. Don't you see? Mr. Crawford's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and commanding. He was staring directly at her now, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. Knowledge is power. It always has been, and those who seek it, truly seek it, pay the price. There are things out there, things you can't even begin to understand. But you will understand. You will all understand in time. Ella shuddered as the words hung in the air, a weight she couldn't shake off. She wasn't the only one feeling it. Across the room, other students shifted nervously, their eyes darting around, unease spreading like a disease. No one ever left Mr. Crawford's class without feeling different. There was always this nagging sense of paranoia, a feeling of being watched long after the bell had rung. It wasn't long before the effects of Mr. Crawford's lessons began to show. Students who had once been carefree and energetic now walked through the halls with hollow eyes, as if they had seen something no one else could. Their steps were slower, their faces drawn, and when they spoke, their voices lacked the spark they once had. They looked over their shoulders constantly, as though something or someone was following them. Rumors spread that Mr. Crawford's curse had begun to take its toll on the students as well. Those who had spent too much time under his tutelage were said to have nightmares, vivid and violent, of shadowy figures, twisted faces, and dark figures beckoning them into the unknown. Some students claimed they had seen the ghostly shapes of people trapped within the walls of the classroom, their faces contorted in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. And then there was the matter of Mr. Crawford's eyes. It had started with subtle changes, a flicker of something strange when he would stare at a student for too long, a deep, unsettling look that seemed to pierce straight through them. But over time, his eyes began to change. They grew darker, almost inhuman, like black holes that consumed everything they touched. His pupils, once sharp and piercing, became dilated, as though his mind was no longer fully his own. One afternoon, during a particularly long and grueling lecture, Ella found herself trapped in the teacher's gaze. She couldn't look away, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't. It was as though some unseen force was holding her in place. His stare seemed to reach deep inside her, and she felt her pulse quicken, her breath shallow as her thoughts scattered in every direction. Then she saw it, a flicker in his eyes. Something wrong. Behind the cold, hollow stare, there were faces, distorted, twisted, contorted in agony, their mouths wide in silent screams. She saw them all, trapped in his eyes, each one a soul who had been consumed by his insatiable hunger for knowledge. The cursed faces of the people he had sacrificed, the ones who had paid the price for his insidious thirst for power. Ella gasped and jerked back, breaking the connection. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her mind, but the image lingered in her vision, like an afterimage burned into her brain. She could still see their eyes, the tortured souls that had become part of Mr. Crawford's eternal punishment. From that day on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. She would hear whispers when she was alone, voices that called her name softly, beckoning her to return. Sometimes, she would feel a cold breath on the back of her neck, or the brush of fingers against her skin when no one was around. The students who had once been her friends started to change too. They would stare off into space, muttering to themselves, their eyes wide and unfocused. And the more time they spent in Mr. Crawford's class, the more they changed. They became pale and gaunt, their personalities warped, their minds consumed by the same obsession that had taken hold of their teacher. It was as though Mr. Crawford's curse was spreading, like a virus, infecting everyone it touched. But there was no escape. The more she tried to distance herself, the more the whispers grew louder, the more the visions of those trapped souls filled her mind. They were everywhere, in the hallways, in her dreams, in her thoughts. They were waiting for her to understand. One night, Ella decided to confront Mr. Crawford. She couldn't live like this anymore, with the voices and the visions and the constant, suffocating terror. She needed answers. She waited until after class, when the room was empty. The lights flickered overhead as she stood at the doorway, her hand gripping the frame. Mr. Crawford was at his desk, his back to her, scribbling in his notebook as he did every day. He didn't seem to notice her approach, his mind lost in his endless search for forbidden knowledge. "Mr. Crawford," Ella said, her voice trembling. He didn't respond at first, but then slowly, deliberately, he turned his head to face her. His eyes locked onto hers, and she felt the familiar weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "You've seen what lies beneath the surface, the knowledge that has been hidden for centuries, the price that must be paid." Ella nodded, barely able to breathe under his gaze. "You can't escape it," Mr. Crawford continued, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "You are part of it now. You will understand, just as I have. There is no turning back." And as his words sank in, Ella knew there was no escape. The curse had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before her. She was bound to him now, trapped in his web of endless knowledge and eternal torment. The pursuit of power, the pursuit of forbidden understanding, it had consumed them all, body and soul. And as Mr. Crawford's twisted smile grew wider, Ella felt the darkness close and around her, suffocating her thoughts, her breath, her very existence. The cursed history teacher had won, and she, like the others before her, was lost to the endless cycle of his torment. The days following their last investigation felt like a blur for the group of students. Each of them, in their own way, had been affected by what they had uncovered. The discovery of the cursed history teacher, the whispers of forgotten souls, the footsteps that stalked the empty halls. They were no longer the carefree teenagers who had once walked these corridors with naive innocence. The school, once a place of routine and study, now felt like a living entity, pulsating with malevolent energy. They could feel its presence, as if it was aware of them, watching them with an insidious patience. They sat together one last time, gathered in the dim light of the old library, the room where it had all started. The pages of the journal they had found, filled with cryptic notes and the faded words of previous students who had walked the same path, were now carefully tucked away in a box. They had learned too much, uncovered too many dark secrets, but there was no turning back. The weight of their knowledge pressed down on them, making it hard to breathe. "Do you think it's over?" Ella asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. She sat next to Jack, her eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. The sounds of the school, the constant creaks and groans, had become unbearable to her. Every corner seemed to hold a new terror. Every shadow stretched longer than it should have. Jack, always the most skeptical of them all, shook his head. "No, it's not over. The school, this place, it's not done with us. We've only just begun to understand what it really is." His voice was low, the weight of his own growing paranoia clear in his eyes. The sound of footsteps echoed through the library, though no one was there. "I think the school is feeding on us now. It knows what we've learned." They all fell silent, each of them processing what Jack had just said. It wasn't just the teachers or the strange occurrences. It was the school itself. The cursed history teacher had been the warning, an example of what the institution could do to those who got too close to the truth. It consumed everything and everyone in its path, using their fears, their ambitions, their regrets to grow stronger. And now, they were part of its history. Their names would be etched into the very walls of the school, forever tied to its dark legacy. As they spoke, they couldn't ignore the pull of the school, the way it seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. They had tried to leave before, many times, late nights trying to escape its grasp, running through the halls as fast as they could, only to find themselves pulled back in. The school had a way of keeping its secrets buried, of trapping those who sought to unearth them. The students had become part of its twisted narrative, and now there was no way out. The air in the library grew thick, the light from the overhead lamps flickering erratically. Their phones had long since lost signal, the world outside the school seeming to disappear with each passing moment. It was as though they had slipped into a different reality altogether, one where time and space no longer obeyed the laws they once knew. "I think we've been here too long," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. She was sitting near the window, her face pale as she stared out at the darkening sky. The trees outside had begun to shift unnaturally, their branches twisting and bending in ways they shouldn't. There was a shape, a shadow, moving in the distance, too tall and too distorted to belong to any person they knew. "We can't leave," Jack said, his voice breaking the silence. "The school is part of us now. It doesn't let go of anyone. It doesn't matter if we're inside or outside. It will always follow us. And the footsteps, those footsteps are just the beginning." The words hung in the air, chilling them all to the bone. They had uncovered too much. They had opened doors that should have remained closed, and now they were paying the price. Each of them could feel the creeping dread settling into their bones, the terror that the school's curse would never let them escape. They could hear it in the silence that surrounded them, the footfalls that echoed even in their minds, like an insistent heartbeat that wouldn't stop. "I heard it again," Maya whispered. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source. The footsteps, they were right behind me, even when I was alone. I can't get away from it. I can't breathe. "I know," Ella said quietly, her hand clutching the journal tightly. "I hear them too, everywhere you go. No matter where I hide, no matter how far I run, I always hear those footsteps following me. They never stop. It's like they want something. They want us." A heavy silence settled between them, the room growing colder with each passing second. It was a silence that pressed down on them, squeezing the air from their lungs. The footsteps were no longer just sounds. They had become something far worse, presence. Something that was always near, always waiting. Jack stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His eyes were wide, frantic. "We can't stay here. We need to leave now. We. The words were cut off by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking toward them. They froze, turning toward the doorway. But there was no one there. No, Maya whispered, backing away from the door. It's the school. It's always been the school. It's the one following us. We can't outrun it. Ella felt her heart race. She stood up, too, as if her body was being forced to move against her will. Her legs felt like lead as she moved toward the door, but she couldn't stop herself. Something was pulling her forward. Something was calling her back to the place she had tried so hard to leave behind. As she stepped into the hallway, she felt it again, the cold breath against the back of her neck. The footsteps were there, behind her, closer than they had ever been. She didn't turn around, but she knew. They were there. It was then that she realized the school wasn't just alive. It was hunting. It was feeding off their fear, their desperation, their will to leave. And now, there was no escape. The school had them. It would always have them. And as they stumbled toward the exit, hoping against hope to break free, Ella's heart sank as she heard the sound of footsteps once more. But this time, they weren't behind her. They were right beside her, as if the school had finally caught up to her, claiming her as part of its dark, cursed history. Some mysteries, Ella realized with a cold shiver, should remain unsolved. The school was not just a building. It was a trap, an entity designed to feed on the very essence of those who dared to uncover its secrets. And now, no matter how far they ran, they were part of its story. Forever. The footsteps continued, never stopping. The door to the outside world, just inches away, began to close. And Ella, along with her friends, knew, with chilling certainty, that they were trapped. Trapped within the walls of the haunted school forever.